My father-in-law brought a 19-year-old girl home 3 days after Christmas, introduced her as his companion, and by New Year's Eve, she was locked inside the guest room at the end of the hall, crying so hard you could hear it through the walls. My name is June. I'm a family law paralegal. I've spent 15 years reading other people's worst moments off court documents, and I still wasn't prepared for what happened inside that house in Knoxville, Tennessee, over the next 4 weeks. There are families that look fine from the outside. You drive past their house on a Sunday and see the wreath still on the door, the porch, lights on a timer, the minivan in the driveway. You assume everything is working the way it should. And then someone says one wrong sentence at a dinner table, and you realize the whole thing was a stage set. Just walls. No house behind them. My husband's family had the kind of house I mean. Beautifully decorated, impeccably managed, with enough history behind every object on the shelf to fill a book nobody would ever actually want to read. My father-in-law, Walter, had built his heating and cooling business from nothing. He was 71 years old. He had an opinion about everything and shared it without being asked. His late wife, Beverly, had died 2 years before I ever joined the family, but her photograph still sat on the console table in the entryway, framed in walnut wood, next to a small silk flower arrangement. Martha, the housekeeper, replaced every other month. I always thought of Beverly's photo as the first thing guests saw when they walked in, which meant Beverly was still, in some way, the person welcoming you into that house. The night Walter sat us all down to make his announcement, I remember the sound of silverware hitting the plate. He didn't do it to call attention. He just set his fork down too hard, the way people do when they're gathering themselves to say something they've already rehearsed 50 times, but still aren't sure will land right. My husband, Connor, was sitting next to me. Across the table were his sister, Nadine, and her husband, Boyd. Walter sat at the head, the seat he always occupied even when Beverly was alive. The roast was still warm. The bread basket hadn't been touched. Walter looked at the table rather than at us. I have someone I'd like you to meet. Her name is Jess. She's been living in a difficult situation, and I've invited her to stay here for a while. Connor put his glass down slowly. How old is she? Walter said, 19. The room became a different temperature. I felt it change the way you feel a door open, in winter. Connor's jaw tightened. Nadine laughed before she could stop herself, then pressed her fingers to her mouth. Boyd reached across and put a hand on his wife's arm. The gesture looked supportive, but I'd learned to read Boyd the way you learn to read a contract you haven't been asked to sign yet. His hand on Nadine's arm wasn't comfort. It was a signal to wait. Walter continued. She'll be staying in the guest room downstairs. I've already made the arrangements, Connor said. The guest room next to Mom's old sewing room. That's the one, Walter said. Connor pushed back from the table. There were no more sentences after that. He walked out to the back porch, and I heard the screen door shut behind him. Nadine stared at her father. Boyd looked at the bread basket like he was counting the rolls. I stayed where I was because someone had to. Walter, I said quietly, is there anything you want to tell us about her situation? About why she needs to be here? He looked at me. Walter rarely looked directly at me, which was something I had long since accepted. He looked at me that night, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Not defiance, not arrogance. Just a very old kind of exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying something alone for longer than anyone should. She's fragile, he said. I'll handle the details myself. He stood up and left the dining room without touching his roast. I sat alone at the table for a few minutes. The silk flowers next to Beverly's photo caught the overhead light, and I found myself staring at them until they blurred. Something about this was wrong. But wrong the way a number in a column is wrong. Not obviously, not loudly. Just off, when you've spent enough time looking at that kind of thing. Jess arrived 2 days later in a pickup truck, driven by someone none of us recognized who didn't get out to help her carry her things. She had one bag. A black duffel, the zipper held together on one end with a rubber band. She was slight and pale and wore a green flannel shirt 2 sizes too large. When Walter met her at the door, he didn't touch her arm, didn't put a hand on her shoulder. He stepped aside and gestured into the house the way a person shows a hotel room to someone who can't afford to be picky. I watched from the kitchen. She stopped when she saw Beverly's photo. She stood there for what felt like a full minute, looking at it. Then she pressed her hands together in front of her and dipped her chin, just slightly. Not a social gesture. Something quieter than that, like she was apologizing to someone who couldn't hear her. Nadine was standing 2 feet behind me. She said, under her breath, she's performing. She's already performing and she hasn't even put her bag down. I didn't answer. Because the thing about someone performing is that it usually comes with an audience they're trying to impress. And Jess didn't know we were watching. The hallway was empty except for her and a photograph. Walter installed a new keypad lock on the guest room door that same week. He told Martha that meals should be left on a tray outside the room. He told the rest of us that Jess needed privacy and that we should respect that. Connor came to me that first night and said, "My father is out of his mind." I said, "Something's wrong, but I don't think it's what you think." He said, "Then what is it?" I didn't have an answer yet. I just had the feeling. The number that didn't add up. What I knew was this. Walter had stopped being a man who did things for no reason somewhere around 1987. Everything he did had a logic. Sometimes the logic was old-fashioned, or stubborn, or plain unkind. But there was always a reason. And locking a 19-year-old girl in a room in his house, avoiding all of his children's questions, changing the locks, accepting the disgrace of the story, none of that was something Walter would do for a girl he'd simply developed feelings for. The math didn't work. Over the next several days, the house arranged itself into siege positions. Nadine drove over every other morning with baked goods nobody asked for and questions she tried to make sound casual. Boyd accompanied her twice. He had a habit of standing slightly apart from the group, hands in his pockets, making observations that sounded like concern. I'd watched him do it for 6 years. He never said anything unkind directly. He just introduced the idea of the unkind thing and let other people say it. Once he said to Nadine, while I was in the kitchen, "The business is in your dad's name. If he brings someone in as a spouse, even informally, the asset question gets complicated. She might not even have to fight for it. It could just happen." Nadine came to me that same afternoon, asking how quickly someone could establish common law marriage rights in Tennessee. "I'm a paralegal, not her attorney," I told her. "But common law marriage hasn't been recognized in Tennessee since 2017. She looked momentarily relieved. Then Boyd said something to her I didn't hear, and she came back 20 minutes later asking about informal cohabitation agreements. The tray of food outside Jess's door came back every night about half-eaten. Martha told me the soup was always the thing she ate. Everything else was left. Martha's eyes were dark when she told me this, and Martha was not a person who showed much on her face. She said, "That girl eats like someone who forgot she's allowed to." I kept working. I kept watching. I drove into Knoxville 3 days a week for work, and I spent the other 2 days at Walter's house, ostensibly helping Connor and secretly looking at everything I could see. Here's what I could see. The tray. The lock. A new prescription bottle in the recycling bin. Something I couldn't identify, printed with a pharmacy label from a town 2 hours east of us called Irwin. A heating pad still in the packaging, left in the hallway and brought inside before I could look closely. Walter's car, gone before 7 in the morning twice in 1 week. When I asked Martha where he'd gone, she said she didn't know. She said it looking at the counter, not at me. Boyd started making his visits alone around the 2nd week. He didn't bring baked goods. He brought a folder once, tucked under his arm, which he put in his car when he left without showing it to anyone. I noticed because that's what I do. I notice what gets put away instead of put on the table. The night I heard Jess cry out was a Thursday. Connor and I were in the upstairs guest room. It was past 11. The house was quiet enough that I could hear the heat cycling through the vents. And the sound. A sound, not a scream. Something below a scream. The kind of sound that comes out of a person when they're trying not to make it and losing the fight. It stopped, started again, sharper. Then Walter's voice, low and urgent, saying something I couldn't make out through the floor. Connor sat up. I put my hand on his arm the same way Boyd put his on Nadine's, but for a completely different reason. I said, "Wait." He said, "June." "I know," I said. "But if you go down there hot, it goes wrong. Let me find out what's actually happening first." He didn't go, but I watched him sit on the edge of the bed the rest of that night, listening. In the morning, Walter came to breakfast looking like he'd aged a year. There was a faint scratch along his forearm that he kept turned away from the table. Connor saw it. He didn't say anything at breakfast. He said it to me in the car afterward. "Those look like fingernail marks." "I know," I said. He said, "June, if he's hurting that girl." "If he is," I said, "we handle it correctly, not by kicking in a door and assuming." He looked at me. I know he wanted to argue, but he trusted my professional instincts in a way that I still try not to take lightly. I made some calls. I have a contact at a pharmacy data service I've used before for estate cases. It's not public information, but it's not illegal to cross-reference either, not the way I did it. I gave her Irwin, Tennessee, Walter's name, and asked if there were any active prescriptions. There weren't any in his name, but there was a standing prescription for someone named Jess, last name withheld, for a category of medication used primarily in the management of a neurological seizure disorder. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the firm for about 10 minutes after that call. A seizure disorder, not a woman being kept against her will, a patient. Or something more complicated than either of those things. I went back to the house that afternoon and I found Walter in his study. I closed the door behind me. "Walter," I said, "Jess is sick." He looked up from his desk. His face did something complicated that lasted about 1 second and then went flat. "That's none of your business, June. It's my business when Connor is 4 hours from calling the police, and Nadine is asking me about civil asset protection law," I said. "Whatever you're protecting, you need to tell me enough that I can protect it too. Or this house goes up in flames and Jess is standing right in the middle of it." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he was going to send me out of the room. Then he said, "She has a condition that causes seizures and episodes of severe physical distress. The medications have to be managed carefully. She can't be upset. She can't be exposed to stress." I said, "Why is she here and not in a care facility?" Walter didn't answer that. I asked a different way, "Who is she to you?" He picked up a pen. He held it. He set it down. "I'll tell you when I'm ready." That was it. I could have pushed. I've pushed harder in depositions. But something in the way he said it made me think pushing would cause him to lock the door on me too. And the door was the problem. The more doors in that house, the worse it was going to get. That evening, I overheard Boyd on the back porch. He was on the phone. He spoke very quietly, but I was in the utility room with the window cracked and sound travels differently in November. He said, "It doesn't matter what she is to him. What matters is the paper trail. If he dies without updating his will, Tennessee defaults to the biological heirs. But if he's established any kind of informal dependency relationship with her, that gets messy. I need you to find out if he's updated the will in the last 6 months." He said it to someone. I didn't know who yet. I came inside and wrote down what I'd heard word for word. The next day, Nadine came to me crying. Not the kind of crying that wants to be comforted. The kind that wants permission. She said, "I grew up in this house. Mom died in this house. I can't watch Dad turn it into something that has nothing to do with us." I said, "I know," she said. "Boyd says I need to protect myself legally. He says if Dad is serious about this girl." I said, "What exactly is Boyd suggesting you do?" She wiped her face. "He drafted something. A kind of petition to the probate court. He says it's just to put a flag on any asset transfers until we know what's happening." I said, "Is he a probate attorney?" She said, "No, but he knows someone." I said, "Nadine, don't file anything. Don't sign anything. Not until I tell you the situation is what Boyd is saying it is." She looked at me with that expression I'd seen before from clients. The one that meant they didn't want my answer. They wanted permission to do the thing they'd already decided to do. She said, "Why are you defending him?" I said, "I'm not defending anyone. I'm asking you to wait 48 hours. She left without promising me anything. I drove to Irwin 2 days later. I told Connor I had an errand. That was technically true. I'd located the clinic that had been managing Jess's care, a small neurology practice connected to the regional medical center. And I called ahead and said, I was a family representative following up on a patient's transition to home care. The nurse I spoke to was careful but not unhelpful. She confirmed that Jess had been a patient there. She confirmed the condition was serious and progressive without proper management. She said that the previous legal guardian, a family member, she didn't specify the relationship, had recently surrendered guardianship following a dispute that she wasn't able to detail. I asked who had assumed care responsibilities. She said a private party who'd submitted a letter of intent to the court to establish medical guardianship. I asked if she could tell me that party's name. She said she wasn't able to do that. I thanked her and drove back to Knoxville. I didn't know everything, but I knew enough. Jess wasn't Walter's companion. She wasn't his girlfriend. She was something he was protecting, and someone else had failed to protect her first. And the whole messy theater of the past 3 weeks, the locked door, the changed locks, the pretense of a romantic arrangement, was a shell around something Walter hadn't figured out how to explain. I got home at 6. Connor was in the kitchen. I set my bag down and said, "Before anything else happens, I need you to hear something." He turned from the stove. "I think your father is trying to protect someone, not pursue someone. And I think the way he's doing it is a disaster." And I think there are people in this house who are going to use that disaster against him. And I need you to be the person who doesn't. Connor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are you not telling me?" I said, "I'm not telling you. I'm telling you in the right order." He almost smiled. That was the thing about Connor. He almost never smiled at the right moments and almost always did at the wrong ones. It was one of the things I'd loved about him for 11 years. That night, it happened. I was in the upstairs hall when I heard it. A full sound, not muffled, sharp, broken, desperate. A voice I'd only heard once before, through a floor. "Help, please," then silence, then again. I was at the top of the stairs before I'd made a decision. Connor was right behind me. We hit the downstairs hall and the sound was worse down there. Not louder, just more real. The door at the end of the hall had a sliver of light beneath it, and we could hear Walter's voice, clipped and scared, saying things like, "Stay still and look at me and breathe. Just breathe." Connor knocked. Then he pounded. Then he said, "Dad, open this door right now, or I'm taking it off." Nothing. He took 3 steps back and hit the door with his shoulder at the lock. It took 2 tries. The door frame splintered on the second one, and the door swung hard into the wall. What we saw stopped both of us completely still. Jess was on the bed, curled on her side, shaking, not crying. Convulsing, or close to it, her arms pulled into her chest, her whole body rigid, and then releasing, and then rigid again. Walter was kneeling on the floor next to her, one hand on her back, not pressing, just there, present. On the nightstand were 3 different medication bottles, a glass of water, a folded wet cloth, and a pulse oximeter clipped to a phone stand so he could see the numbers without holding it. It was a sick room. That's what it was. Not a locked room, not a seeker room, a sick room. Walter looked up at us. I expected rage. He had none left. He just said, "Close the door." I stepped inside instead. I went to the other side of the bed and I looked at Jess and I said, "Can you hear me?" She turned her head slightly. Her eyes were unfocused but open. She said, in a voice like paper tearing, I'm okay. Don't call anyone." Connor stood in the doorway. I watched him look at the medication. Look at the pulse oximeter. Look at Walter kneeling on the floor of a guest room at 11 o'clock at night, in his pajamas, like a man who had been doing this for a very long time. The anger left his face the way light leaves a room. Slowly, and then all at once. "Walter," Connor said, "what is she to you?" Walter's shoulders dropped. He put one hand over his eyes. He was quiet for so long I thought he'd chosen not to answer again. Then he said, "She's my granddaughter." The word landed and nobody moved. Connor said it back. Walter nodded. He kept his hand over his eyes. "I had a son before you or Nadine," he said. "Before Beverly. I was 22. The girl, her name was Anita. We weren't together long. She moved away and I didn't know until years later that she'd had the baby. By then Beverly and I were married and I was too afraid. Too much of a coward. I sent money every year. I never went to find him." He dropped his hand. His face was a kind of open I had never seen on it. "His name was Dean. He died last spring. Overdose. Jess is his daughter. Her mother's been out of the picture since Jess was 4. After Dean died, Jess ended up with Dean's uncle, a man named Clint, who spent about 8 months running through Dean's life insurance payout and then decided Jess was a liability. She was having seizures, missing work at the diner, costing him money. He told her she had to leave. A 19-year-old with a neurological disorder and nowhere to go. Walter looked at me. At me specifically for the second time in 11 years. A social worker found the family connection through the hospital records. She contacted me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to explain to you and Connor and Nadine that I had a son you never knew about and now a great niece. A granddaughter who needed a place to land. I thought if I said she was someone I was seeing, at least it would buy me time to figure out the adoption paperwork. The guardianship. The estate planning. I thought I could fix it quietly and then explain. He looked at Jess. She had stopped shaking. Her eyes were closed. I thought the story would be less shameful than the truth. Connor sat down on the floor with his back against the wall. Just sat down right there in the doorway of the sick room, like his legs had stopped cooperating. I'd seen him cry 3 times in 11 years. This wasn't that. This was something quieter and worse. He said, "You let us think you were. You let us think the worst possible thing about you. Because you were afraid to tell us you had another son." Walter said, "I was afraid you'd grieve him. A brother you never got to know. I was afraid you'd blame me. I was afraid you'd." He stopped. "Hate you," Connor said. Walter didn't answer. There is a particular kind of silence that happens in a family when everyone in the room finally understands what they're fighting about. It doesn't feel like relief. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels like standing at the bottom of something very tall, looking up, understanding for the first time how far you fell. I stayed with Jess through the night. Walter sat in the chair by the window. Connor went upstairs and I could hear him on the phone, I assumed with Nadine, for about 45 minutes. At some point after 2 in the morning, Jess opened her eyes and looked at me. She said, "He talks about you. He says you're the one who pays attention." I said, "He should have paid more attention himself." She almost smiled. She said, "He was scared." I said, "He was. That doesn't make it right." She said, "I know, but he's been the only person who didn't make me feel like a problem to be solved." I didn't want to cause any of this. She turned her face toward the window. "My dad never told me about him either," she said. "I found out from the hospital. I almost didn't reach out. I figured a man who never came to find his son wasn't going to want to know his granddaughter." I said, "Why did you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I was running out of options and I was too tired to be proud about it." I understood that. More than I expected to. Nadine arrived at 7:30 in the morning. Boyd was with her. He had his leather portfolio under his arm, the one I'd seen him carry before. He walked in looking composed in the way people look when they've prepared extensively for a conversation they expect to win. We were all in the kitchen. Walter, Connor, me. Jess was still resting in the guest room, but the door was open for the first time since she'd arrived. Nadine took one look at the table and said, "Tell me what's happening. All of it. Right now." Walter told her, "All of it." The same way he'd told Connor. I watched her face move through stages that had no names I know. Shock first, then something that looked like grief, because it was grief. A brother she'd never met, who was now dead, who she would never get to know. Then anger. And then, quietly, something that looked like shame, though she didn't say anything about that part yet. Boyd listened with his hands flat on the table. When Walter finished, Boyd was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Well, this does change the legal picture considerably. A paternity relationship establishes a line of inheritance that didn't previously exist. Jess will need to be accounted for in any estate planning going forward." I said, "Boyd?" He looked at me. "That's not what this moment is for." He tilted his head slightly. He said, "I'm just trying to be practical." I said, "You've been practical for a month. You've been so practical you paid someone to tell you whether Walter updated his will." The table went quiet in a way that was different from before. Boyd said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I said, "You were on the back porch 2 weeks ago. Utility room window. You asked someone to check for will updates and asset transfers. Who were you calling?" Boyd put his hands in his lap. "I was concerned for Nadine's financial security. That's not a crime." "No," I said. "But filing a probate petition on false pretenses would be a problem. And so would the draft you've been carrying around in that portfolio, which I'm guessing isn't anything Nadine's attorney has reviewed." Nadine looked at her husband. "Boyd?" He said, "I was protecting you." She said, "From what?" He didn't answer immediately, and the pause was long enough to answer for him. He wasn't protecting Nadine. He was protecting his position, a financial position in a family that was more comfortable than anything Boyd had built on his own. Nadine picked up his portfolio and opened it. She flipped through what was inside. I saw her read and I watched her face change a second time that morning. She set it down. She said, "Boyd, this is a motion to have Dad declared partially incapacitated." Boyd said, "It's a protective measure." She said, "You were going to have my father declared incompetent without telling me what you were filing." The kitchen was very still. Connor said, "Get out of my father's house." Boyd said, "Connor." Connor said it again, quieter, which was worse, "Get out." Boyd left. He didn't make a scene. He walked to his car and sat in it for about 10 minutes before driving away. I think he knew when a room had turned against him. He was always good at reading rooms. Nadine sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. None of us filled the silence for her. She needed to sit in it. Eventually, she got up and walked to the guest room. I followed at a distance. I stopped in the hallway. Through the open door, I saw Nadine standing at the foot of Jess's bed. Jess was awake, propped up on the pillow, watching her. Nadine said, "My brother's name was Dean." Jess nodded. She said, "I know. He used to talk about his dad, about the man in Tennessee who sent money every Christmas. He thought about coming to find him for years. He just never got there." Nadine pressed her lips together. She said, "He didn't look like me, did he?" "Your dad?" Jess said, "No, he was shorter. Blue eyes." He laughed at his own jokes. Nadine let out a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely. She sat down in the chair by the window. The same chair Walter had sat in the night before. She said, "I'm sorry for what I said about you. The things I assumed." Jess said, "You didn't know." Nadine said, "I should have tried harder to know." I walked back to the kitchen. I thought some doors are better opened without an audience. The following weeks were not simple. They weren't supposed to be. Walter met with his attorney and drew up a formal guardianship agreement. He initiated the process of updating his estate plan to include Jess as a recognized dependent heir, not as an equal beneficiary, but with a trust set aside for her medical care and housing until she turned 25 or achieved financial stability, whichever came first. He did it transparently, with Connor and Nadine present, with their attorneys reviewing every document. Connor didn't forgive his father overnight. He was honest about that. He sat across the kitchen table from Walter one morning and said, "I need you to understand that what I had to think about you. For those weeks, that's not something I can just set down. You put that on me. You put it on all of us. And you put it on Jess, too, because she had to walk into a house full of people who thought the worst of her, and she did it anyway, because she had nowhere else to go." Walter said, "I know." Connor said, "Say it like you know what you did." Walter was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I made my shame into her problem, and that was the worst thing I could have done, because she's already carried more shame that belonged to other people than any 19-year-old should ever have to." Connor nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't have to. Jess started seeing a neurologist at the University of Tennessee Medical Center. The treatment plan was more aggressive than what she'd been managing in Irwin, and it helped. The episodes became less frequent. She started sleeping more than 5 hours a night. She started eating more than soup. Martha made her biscuits one Sunday, and Jess ate 3 of them standing up at the kitchen counter. And Martha turned away and did dishes with an expression I had never seen on her. Something close to satisfied. Nadine filed for divorce from Boyd in February. She did it quietly, with a family law firm in Knoxville that was not connected to Boyd in any way. I helped her find them. She never asked me if she was doing the right thing. She already knew. One afternoon in March, I was in the entryway on my way out to the car, and I saw Jess standing in front of Beverly's photograph. She'd done it every time she passed that photo. I'd noticed but never said anything. I said, "Did you know her?" Jess shook her head. She said no, but she looks like someone who kept things running. My grandma was like that. You could tell just by looking at them. I said, "Beverly was exactly like that." Jess said, "Do you think she'd be mad about me being here?" I thought about that. I thought about Beverly, who I'd only ever known from photographs and from the things other people said about her. I thought about the silk flowers Martha replaced every other month, which was not a small thing to do for 2 years in a row for someone who was already gone. I said, "I think she would have wanted things done honestly from the beginning, but I think she also would have known that people who are afraid don't always do things the honest way. And I think she would have made sure you had somewhere to land regardless." Jess looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she picked up her jacket from the coat hook and said, "I'm going to take a walk if that's okay." I said, "You don't have to ask." She paused. "I still kind of do," she said. "But I'm working on it." She opened the front door and walked out into the early spring air. I stood in the entryway alone for a moment, looking at Beverly's photo. There are things that happen inside a family that leave marks on the architecture. You can change the furniture and repaint the walls, and they're still there, in the places where the weight fell hardest. In the shape of the door frame, where someone leaned too long. Walter had built his fear into every locked room in that house. It cost him 2 months of his children's trust, his granddaughter's dignity, and the best version of the story he could have told. The one where he told the truth first, while there was still time to tell it cleanly. But he was telling it now. That had to count for something. It doesn't always look like redemption when someone finally does right. Sometimes it just looks like a door left open, and a room full of light. And a girl eating biscuits in a kitchen where nobody's asking her to leave. Some families break and stay broken. Some families break and figure out, slowly and badly and with a lot of wrong turns, how to be something different than what they were. You don't get to choose which kind of family you're in. You only get to choose what you do when the fracture shows. I chose to keep looking until I found the number that didn't add up. And what was hiding behind it wasn't what anyone expected. It never is.